Welcome to our new podcast presented by Mystic-Skeptic Media. We present Jesus the Israelite, a Jewish commentary in the New Testament. My co-host and I will explore available texts which describe the New Testament from a Jewish perspective. And we're going to be very open and very challenging in the sense of using critical methods as well as common sense to try to address this enigmatic text. If we look at the New Testament as a Jewish text, there's so many questions that pop up, such as, can you consider sectarian texts to be part of Judaism, since Judaism has defined itself as non-sectarian, even though now it is very sectarian. That's why they call them movements instead of denominations within Judaism, because they don't want to split up into a bunch of groups. And in the time where the life of Jesus is depicted in the New Testament, there was like 6 or 7 different groups, and those groups were at odds with each other, and that in some Jewish circles say was what brought about the great exile that happened at 70 of the Common Era. Also, there are many myths that we need to dispel about Jewish perspectives on Jesus. Just in my previous series on the Mystic-Skeptic and Raiders of the Unknown, I posted several shows in relation to the rise of anti-Semitism, and some of the stuff that the haters of the Jews were saying were so disturbing and appalling, but they claimed to be speaking on behalf of the Talmud and Jewish sources. And what it was is this is my take on what happened. So at the time of the writing of the Babylonian Talmud, which is one of the major texts, authoritative texts of Judaism, there was all these hearsay stories about conflict they had with different sectarian groups, one including Jewish Christians or Gentile Christians who were trying to do outreach to the Jewish community. In the middle of that, there was also a lot of disinformation regarding to what their views were on God. And according to the Christian perspective, it was actually like hardcore Christians who believed in the Trinity and all the doctrines of their faith, which at that time they weren't fully developed, presenting that to the Jewish community, and the Jewish community rejecting that and rejecting Jesus, and even causing a slander and libelous accusations against him. However, if you look at all the stories that are usually picked out of the Babylonian Talmud, and again, we have to remember the Talmud was written in Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq, far away from the Greco-Roman creation of Christianity. So they had their own way of thinking and their own way of looking at things. They started almost creating stories to counter what they heard. And a lot of it was this idea there was a guy who said he was Messiah, or he said he had miraculous powers, but most likely he didn't. And then they developed these legendary tales, but none of them even make any sense. The dates are wrong. The people involved are wrong. It's all like a hodgepodge of some type of there's such a thing as Adversus Judaeus, which is a series of Christian texts where they try to fight against the Jews. The Babli created an Adversus Nosrim or Christianos, where they were trying to fight against something they didn't understand or they knew enough to create a polemic against. So they started throwing stuff out. Maybe he was a magician, maybe he was a heretic, maybe he was this and that, but they it wasn't part of their history or their story, because they had been either in exile during the time that Jesus was around, their ancestors, or as we know, they were secluded. So whatever they were hearing coming from the trade routes was all these confusing stories, and some of that made it to Islam too. So all these legendary tales of this great man or not great enough, according to them, all that got mixed into that version of the Talmud, which are there too. There's the Jerusalemi, which is the Palestinian Talmud, and the Babli, which is the Babylonian. So all that stuff was recorded, and now the anti-Semites and neo-Nazis can go in and pick and choose their stories that they hate and throw those back at the Jews, saying that we deny Christ, that we want nothing to do with him, that we think of him as an awful person, stuff like that. When in reality, it was just a reaction to this force that was developing next to them in the Mediterranean. So there's a great book called Jesus in the Talmud, where Peter Schaeffer discusses all that. So we can draw some of those interpretations in there. But again, what people understand is that even within Judaism, there are things that are authoritative and you can debate, such as Jewish law. And there are other things which are agadic, which is morals and parables and stories, which are up to debate and you can take what you want from them. In Christianity, you have the opposite, where the legal components of the religion, which both Jesus, Paul, and James discussed, those things you can take or leave or not even consider. And that's what most Christianity is, antinomian. But the miracles, the stories, they're all like real in the greatest sense. The Catholics would say that things can be true metaphorically or spiritually, but they don't have to be true physically. In the majority of Christianity, everything is true at all times in the most literal and the most physical way. And if you veer away from that, then you're a liberal Christian, which is a political term that doesn't even make any sense. You would be an unorthodox Christian, and you have no place in the table because now you're automatically a heretic. In Judaism, to be a heretic is to be treasonous to the main components, which is having cohesiveness and having unity among the group. So we're also going to discuss that. So this long-winded introduction is just to get people up to pace with these two major forces: hardcore Christianity, hardcore Judaism, and then everywhere in between, going back to this enigmatic figure that has caused so much positive influence in the world and so much distortion and I don't think that's what he expected, but it has the system that we live in is this kind of conflictive aspect of they love Jesus, but they don't really understand him. And then in the Jewish community, they don't understand him, and that's why they don't love him. So our job is to help both communities come to better understanding. Nick, do you have some thoughts based on my introduction?
No, I thought you put it very well. It's funny because I don't know if you want me to share any bit of my background at all, but it's kind of the opposite. Because of the influence Jesus has had in my life, I've come to want to keep Torah. So it's kind of had an opposite effect of what you see with Christianity.
So there's a new phenomenon for those people who are not familiar. If you're just coming to our podcast, it's like, what are these guys talking about? Are they missionaries, anti-missionaries, Jews for Jesus, Jews who are confused and are giving this guy a chance that most people don't want to talk about him? The moment you bring him up in Jewish circles, it's so controversial. It's more controversial than talking about God. I was told by one of our professors that Jews don't talk about God because they get into fistfights about it, because they all have different views of what God and how he manifests himself in the world. But I want us to organically discuss our backgrounds, because what happens is that they want to pigeonhole you. So they're like, oh, well, this guy is a disciple of so-and-so, and this guy studies on the rabbi so-and-so. So I got them all figured out. That's not what it's about. We're talking about the stories, the documents, and different ways to look at them. And then you can figure out where we're coming from in the process. And we ourselves are students of the Torah, the mystical writings, and even the sectarian writings, which have parallels all around. So if someone says you cannot write a book about Jesus because you're Jewish, or the moment you start considering some of the concepts that Christianity teaches, you must be kicked out of the community, that is a so narrow-minded of perspective, and it also shows that you have insecurities on your own identity. And the same goes for Christians. If Christians cannot question their own texts, study them, look at them from different angles, then their faith is built in a very shallow form, because it cannot be challenged. So we're not apologists for anyone. What we are people who, in our connection with God, we have found things that are powerful in all different types of traditions, but then which traditions are more consistent with the original premise? So I always tell people that if someone wants to pigeonhole me, you would see me as like someone who believes in Jewish philosophy, in the sense of like stuff has to make sense and stuff has to be consistent. So there, in Jewish philosophy, there's two perspectives, or more than that, whereas you're either a rationalist or a mystic. But I think that's why our overall organization is Mystic and Skeptic, because we can question things and we can also draw from the mystical stuff and incorporate it as it makes our experience of God and of our practice more holistic and full of energy and vibrant. So this is just introduction. So we're gonna throw a bunch of stuff out, and we'll see how much can we cover within an hour. So Nick, as you have shared, the more you study Jesus, the more it makes you connect with what we would call Judaism, because some people say you can keep the Torah without Judaism, and I believe that to be impossible, because Judaism, and this is where people get confused, Judaism is Torah, because Torah in Jewish terms is all of Jewish experience. So when the Jews were giving the message of God at Sinai, when Abraham encountered God in Canaan, that was the birth of what we call now Judaism and the Jewish religion. People would get all technical and say, well, Abraham wasn't a Jew because he was a Babylonian who lived in Canaan. He was a Hebrew because he lived in Hebron. And then the first Jew was Judah, but then there were Israelites and this and that. The idea is that nowadays, and people try to split it between rabbinic Judaism, medieval Judaism, ancient Judaism, and all that. The idea is that there has been people who served the God of Israel, and those people have documented their experience. So if you look at the Torah, which is commonly known as the 5 books of Moses, that is one segment of the documentation of their experience with God. Then there's the prophets, which is in unison and support of that legal system. And then you have the sectarian group writings, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the New Testament, pseudepigrapha, and other texts. Within that realm, then there's more interpretation and more knowledge that comes from the Talmudic period, the different rabbis of the generations, and the medieval mystics and everybody else. So the whole panoply of Jewish experience is what we call Judaism, or Torah, in the sense of it's all teachings from God, because the original word for Torah is teaching.
Yeah.
Now there's been groups that they pick and choose whatever they like from whatever Jewish history, and they've created their own sense of keeping Torah. And at times it supports what Jews have been doing with kashrut and Shabbat observance, and at times it's in conflict because they claim they understand and they know what's going on. So the clearest way to describe that is the calendar. So they'll take the calendar that most Jews follow, which is both lunar and solar, and they'll say, no, they got it all wrong. It's either solar or it's lunar. And that's what the Muslims did. The Muslims took the lunar one and they said, we're going to only focus on that one, and that's the one from God. The solar one can go away. Then the Christians took the solar one and they made that one the main one. And you can go into all kinds of conspiracy theories that Sunday is the day of the sun and that Jesus is a form of Apollo and this and that. But when it's all said and done, we're trying to look at the original. And I know we've had debates about what's original and what has been a modification, and what people claim now God is telling them, which contradicts what God said back then and all this stuff. But I want to talk about normative Judaism, even though according to some circles there is no normative Judaism, because we don't have one stream, but many streams. And one of my professor, who may his memory be a blessing, he said that Judaism is so vast that you can also almost make like a smorgasbord of what Judaism can be to you without distorting it. So what has happened right now in progressive circles is that they take bits and pieces of Judaism and they distort it to answer the questions and to give them what they want. And I feel in the Christian groups who are now into the Hebrew roots and the Jewish Christian perspective, whatever they want to call it, they do the same. They take bits and pieces they like and they incorporate them and then they toss everything out. And the Jewish community is left in this like disdain of what they're doing, because even the most radical Jews, such as Spinoza and Sabbatai Zvi, and the ones who we consider the worst heretics in the world, they came to their perversion of Torah with knowledge. And out of knowledge is that they cut stuff out and they rework stuff. But what you have happen in a lot of Christian groups, they have no knowledge of Judaism. They have very basic understanding of the Old Testament, and they start bringing the sisters and cutting everything up without any sense of system of understanding and without any of the major Jewish concepts that we care about, such as Jewish continuity, Jewish future existence, and Jewish survival and thriving in the world. So it's really easy for an outsider to walk in and say, this is all trash. I like the cup, I like the candle, but everything else has to go. And that's easy for them to say because they don't face persecution. They don't face attacks from random strangers. They don't face ongoing inner war about what does it mean to be chosen and part of the world, and how can we be universalist and separated and sanctified, all those things. That's not part of their experience. So it's really easy for them to pick and choose what they like about Judaism or not. So I want you to share a little bit about your reaction to what I'm saying. And then I want to go back to that because there are some things that are going on in certain podcasts and certain Christian resources that are available that are part of that confusion and lack of understanding.
Yeah, so that's kind of my journey to get to where I am now actually started with coming to the realization that I had a very basic understanding of what is called the Old Testament, the Tanakh. And back in March of 2020, God asked me the question, how do you know that what you believe is truth? And so I began to analyze all my beliefs, everything that I thought to be true, and I realized it was all hearsay. Everything that I believed was this pastor said this or this preacher said that, and none of it was because of my own study at all. So I stripped myself of everything I believed, everything I thought the Bible to say, what people told me the Bible said, and I started over. And I started back in Genesis. I started searching out Jewish sources and Hebrew sources, Hebrew scholars, this, that, and the other. And what I realized is, after having discussed with a lot of other Christians the validity of Torah, because like I said, after seeing what Jesus said and taught and did, it does not mesh with mainstream Christianity. And I have a lot of friends in mainstream Christianity, and what you said is like spot on. They have a very, very, very basic understanding of the Torah, the writings, the prophets and the writings. And so it caused me to dive deeper into that. And I wanted to start from the beginning. I didn't want to back up into Torah with all my preconceived notions and ideas. I wanted to read the text, let it speak for itself, and then let that set the tone, the language, the history, the context, let that set the tone for coming into the New Testament and actually understanding it from a Hebraic or Jewish perspective. So no, I'm right there with you on everything you said.
So as you were sharing, I was thinking about something that's very important. And so we can show people how to have healthy debate and healthy like opposition to someone else's view. We're going to follow the principle that Abraham Joshua Heschel taught us Jews to do, and which is never mention the person by name and never attack them personally or humiliate them, because the Talmud says that it's better to be thrown into a fire, a furnace, than to humiliate someone in public. But I am gonna destroy their arguments. So if anybody decides to come after me as a person, you're going against my standard. My standard is, don't come after me, come after my ideas. And I was sharing with someone that in my previous shows, we had a conflict with the people that believe in aliens. And instead of going after my arguments, all they did wanted to destroy me as a person and character assassination. And that's a sign of not having anything to respond because their arguments are weak. So I'm going to throw out some arguments that are out there in the blogosphere and the YouTubes and the different groups out there. And then you guys figure out where it's coming from. And again, it's the ideas that are problematic, not the individuals. I have great love for people who I've encountered and had discussions with, but there are some very weak arguments, and there are some things that are not as big of a slam dunk as they claim. So the first issue that I'm going to bring up is the problem of authority. So one individual came after the rabbis in one of his blog posts saying, and the rabbis is the Jewish teachers, which in Judaism, a rabbi is not just a teacher, is more like a judge or an adjudicator of Jewish law and practice. So the ancient rabbis, the Talmudic rabbis, again, wrote some mean things or things that can be misconstrued or that can be interpreted in all kinds of ways. And this gentleman was saying that if they were wrong about Jesus by not supporting him, even though maybe they didn't even heard of him, they must be wrong about everything else. And it all came because there was this very famous conservative pundit that has a Torah study every Tuesday, and he says, well, the rabbi said this and the rabbi said that, and he was furious that his favorite conservative Jew was quoting his heroes and that he was interpreting the Bible in a Jewish way. So his dream is that he will interpret it in a Christian way and agree with him on every point. So I had a long discussion with this person. We went back and forth for a while. May God rest his soul. And we came to this agreement that if he was going to attack the rabbis, he needed to attack every clerical religious leader of every religion. Because the first thing that you learn when you are in leadership in a religious community is that if you start attacking certain groups, then those groups have the right to cry foul. So as Jews, the moment we get attacked, the first thing we're going to think is that people are anti-Semitic, because they don't only attack our thoughts, they attack our religion and our people. So again, it goes back to being hateful. So the biggest issue about authority that comes up all the time between Christians and Jews is who can interpret the Bible correctly. Christians believe, and this is something that I found it fascinating. One of the books that we're going to discuss is the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which came out in the last 10 years. It has a lot of great stuff in it. One guy didn't want nothing to do with it or even listen to it because it kind of made him uncomfortable. So I read in a Catholic blog that someone said, how dare these Jewish scholars and academics try to interpret the New Testament if they don't have the Holy Spirit in them? And this lady was being consistent, because that's what Catholic tradition teaches, and Protestant tradition, all of Christianity says, the moment you believe in Jesus, the Holy Spirit gets inside your heart, and it starts sanctifying you, making you a better person. And then you see things in the scripture that you would never see before. And that's how the doctrine of ongoing revelation and all these things about the saints and things like that in Catholic tradition has come about, because they have this almost like mandate from God to be able to understand everything in a Christological way and something that relates to their doctrine, which comes from this knowledge of God through Jesus. If a Jew picks up the New Testament and says, hey, look at this, this has parallels with the Dead Sea Scrolls, this has parallels with this other text, and they go in the mystical story, stuff like that, they say, oh, well, that's someone who's dead in their sins, who's trying to make sense of a text that is so outside of this world. Kind of like what Jesus said, there are some, to you I speak openly, to other people I speak in parables, because they will see and not hear, and hear and not see, and all this other stuff. So this the Gnostic version of Jesus, which he has, like, you have to be initiate within his mystery cult, and unless you accept certain premises, you don't have access to rest communication. I'm being facetious. I don't mean that Jesus was part of a mystical cult, but that
Right.
that's how they portray it. So
Mhm.
only the right people and the chosen from that perspective have access to this information. It's Protestantism says the opposite. It says that everybody's a minister and a priest, and everybody has access to God, and everybody can read the scriptures and find something from it. And it's interesting that you mentioned that God told you to look at the Torah, so we can talk about that later. Like, how do you
Yeah.
know that God talked to you and He's not talking to other people and stuff like that? But
Yeah.
going back to this issue, if someone, as an academic or a scholar, sees themselves as an authority on the Bible, and this individual saw themselves because they have a lot of knowledge of Hebrew and Aramaic and Babylonian religion, stuff like that, they see themselves as an authority, and they think that their view of the Bible, including the Tanakh, the Hebrew scriptures, was more legitimate and more consistent than the people who were 100 to 1,000 years closer to the writers, who spoke their same language, who kept the traditions, millenary tradition that was passed down through the centuries, who lived in the land and had access to all this wisdom. To me, that's a form of arrogance and against supersessionist mentality, where it's like either him because he knows Jesus, or because he was trained in Christian circles, or because he has access to information that the rabbis didn't have, has a more accurate understanding. Then you should have like a very humble idea. It's like, hey, the rabbis maybe got a few things wrong, but I'm gonna listen to what they have to say and incorporate that into my understanding. Well, that's my second point. There's another group of a Christian, you would say, well-learned individuals, which they're still in that mentality where they get to discern which Jewish sources and which Jewish interpretations are correct and which ones are wrong. And it always goes back, they're correct because they support the teachings of Jesus, and they're incorrect when they don't support the teachings of Jesus. Okay? But that's your view of Jesus.
Right.
I've told people that there's thousands of Jesus, and they're like, what are you talking about? Because people make Jesus in their own image. So when you pick up the book of Mark, which is the oldest, the Gospel of Mark, actually the writings of Paul are older, but if you pick up the Gospel that we know as the oldest, and you start reading word by word what's going on, you're already painting in your head the look, the inflection, the way that he describes himself, and the baggage from 2,000 years of tradition that incorporate what that person was. If you were an alien or someone in the desert and you picked up the book and you saw this story about a miracle worker and a Jewish guy who had access to God, who could, talk to demons and back and forth, you might come up with a completely different perspective. So that's there's a couple of stories that I can share about people that I met who kind of went through that, but it goes back to happen to find out that one individual that I was debating is in love with the German academic scholarly views of Jesus. Well, guess what? The German academic views of Jesus were pre-Nazi Gentile focused. So I won't call them anti-Semitic, but I will call them Gentile focused and universalistic in their view. So one time I was talking to this individual, and he said, in Isaiah, when the end of times comes, you will see this utopian world that is circumcision free. And I was like, what are you talking about? I went back into the text, and nowhere did it say that Jews stopped being Jews. But the German mentality, which it was a Protestant post-Enlightenment idea, misinterpreted the teachings of Paul when he said there's no longer Jew nor Greek, male or female, slave or free. So that means that the new man has no identity. And that's the kind of stuff that we're facing in America nowadays, where you have one group of people saying there is no race. We're all the human race. And you have another group that says we need to celebrate everybody's uniqueness. Can you have both? Possibly. But I've actually heard Christian leaders say the church that was established by Jesus went from being a Jewish church to being a universal world church. And that's just that person imposing their white guilt on the way that they go about evangelizing, which starts with the American Christians have the right gospel, and we're going to spread that to the African community in Africa, the Indian community in India, the Asians, and all that. So now he's saying that, in a sense, he's putting himself in the sandals of the apostles, saying, well, we're the bee's knees, and we're going to spread it out to all the savages out there. And that's not what happened. And the gospel back then wasn't the gospel now. So when you hear other groups, and again, with all my love and respect, which are defining the message of Jesus in a narrow way, they're not taking into consideration their own experience and their own desire to get people to find redemption and connect with God, which influences what they think the message of Jesus was. So as we talk more and we develop our show, we're going to talk about, could it be that the message of Jesus was a message that is already contained in the teachings of the Jews? And then if it is, how has it been distorted and turned into something else? Because at the end, you can have people that have the same goal. You want people to be close to God. You want people for their lives to be redeemed and to live a virtuous life. But is it a narrow path that almost no one can achieve? Or is it an open path that is available to everyone? And both Judaism and Christianity have different versions of that. So this individual, which has changed the history of humanity, has particular things to say within those texts. And again, we have to talk about it, and this is what's hurtful and offensive to Christians. We have to talk about it is the words attributed to Jesus. Because we weren't there. And we can say the same thing about the Torah. The words attributed to God and Moses. So now we have two sources. We have way more ancient one, the first 5 books of Moses, then the prophets that were all written individually by different people. And then we have the sectarian teachings of the followers of Jesus and the attributed words that we now have. What the saving grace, no pun intended, is that within those texts that have been preserved, there's so much Jewish wisdom and there's so much Jewish flavor and even ethnic commentary that it's impossible to not see it as Jewish in its inception. And scholars now are creating this sense of you can't call anything Jewish because nothing was Jewish until the 3rd or 5th century, and that is not true. I've read papers where they say Jesus wasn't Jewish. He was a Nazarene, Hebrew or whatever, and that gives it prompts anti-Semites to say, oh yeah, he wasn't Jewish. But in reality, that's why the show is called Jesus the Israelite, because he wasn't only a Jew, he was a member of the Jewish people, and he had not only upbringing, which is depicted in the New Testament, and lifestyle that was Jewish. He had responsibilities and commitments to the well-being of the greater Israelite kingdom, which to me is unbelievable that you can go around calling someone the king of the Jews and never actually discuss what a Jewish monarch was required to do, as well as a Jewish peasant. So let's say he wasn't the king of the Jews. Let's say he was just a regular guy, like my other friend, John Dominic Cruzan, would say. He was just a Mediterranean peasant. He had so many things under his purview as being born under Jewish law that no one ever discusses. Even him going to the river Jordan and immersing himself has precedence throughout the Tanakh and was going on at that time. And they just see it as like he was anointed by John and then he went and started his ministry. the word ministry and anointed by John doesn't make any sense, because John, as depicted in Josephus, had a whole other thing going on. So this is our first episode. It's only 30 minutes. We're gonna leave it at that. But I want people to let us know what they think in the comments, and we're gonna go full force and, you know, tell us if you're offended, if you think it's crazy that we're doing this. But this is for education purpose. We want people to understand the issues, be open to what's going on, and then we bring it all together with our limited knowledge, because we're all still
Yeah.
learning and growing. And when people stand up and say, well, I have all the answers, you know, they don't. So in both religions, you have people who are very arrogant and even quick-witted, which they can fight and debate people and slam them with verses and this and that. That's not what we're here for. We're looking at major concepts, major ideas, and putting it all together with the sense of awe that there's so much out there that we haven't even looked at, and we can grow in the process. So Nick, any closing words?
Oh, I'm excited to get into it though. So I think it'll be really good for your listeners.
Wonderful. So we'll get going next week, and thank you so much for allowing us to pursue the subject and go deep into this topic of importance to the world.